So I'm going to talk about trade wars. And indeed, I have to thank Trump, because it used to be that trade policy was, not a cold topic, but something that was not so interesting, maybe. And clearly, we're going to have a lot of work to do with a lot of data, experiments. Also because Trump is a bit stochastic, there are, I'm sure, a lot of natural experiments to be done. And although I'm going to try to say that maybe there's something a bit deterministic. I mean, as economists, we like, of course, to try to predict these things. So I'm going to try to find some rationale in these things. Okay, so just to give you a bit of context, but I guess you know about it, of course. There are trade wars, and the most recent trade war is clearly on US-China. And I'm going to try to take a European perspective on this issue, and to say how this might affect the EU. So just some random thoughts for the moment on what's happening right now. Clearly, the US-China trade war is going to have an impact on EU because it has a global impact in terms of, for example, increase in predictability, shock on financial markets. I'll come back to this because macroeconomists have things to say on this issue. It's also, depending on whether there's an agreement or not, it's going to certainly affect the structure of international trade relations, and clearly that's going to affect also the EU, given that the EU is clearly based on the idea that multilateralism is a good thing, and clearly multilateralism is put in danger by these trade wars. And depending on whether there is an agreement or not, it's going to affect the EU. So if there's an agreement between China and the US, the nature of the agreement is going to be very important for us. As you may know, a lot of the dispute and the discussions between the Americans and the Chinese are on intellectual property rights, on state subsidies, which we as Europeans also complain to the Chinese. So in some sense, for a long time, European Union did not want to make a coalition with the Americans on these issues, in a sense, against the Chinese. I think we made a big mistake in the European Union. And when the Obama administration was asking, in some sense, for the EU to go for these discussions with the Chinese, we did not want to do that. And we are now having it, but in a much more violent and not so, and a very bilateral way also. So we have certainly some common complaints towards the Chinese, but clearly, whether the agreement between the US and the Chinese will be a bilateral or multilateral, in a sense, whether we will free ride on some of the heavy tactics of Trump is an important issue on which I'm not sure exactly what at that stage whether this will happen or not. There's another type of agreement that you can get is that you have a Chinese commitment to buy US goods. Basically Boeing and not Airbus. And basically for a trade economist, that's exactly identical of having Chinese tariff on European goods. And so that would be the worst scenario, certainly one of the worst scenarios for us. And it would not be WTO compatible from that point of view. And so what would be the EU reaction is a big question. One issue for trade economists is also that for the moment there has not been complaints by the EU on state subsidies by the Chinese, for example, which is a bit strange because we've made complaints against Boeing, but not, again, that's a little bit of a strange thing. Without an agreement, if there's no agreement, you can think of what would be the impact of this trade diversion towards the US and China, because if there are more trade tariffs and quotas between China and US, there will be more trade between US and EU and China and EU. We're doing some work actually to try to simulate what would happen, what would be the change in trade flows if there's no trade agreement, if there's trade war, the trade wars continues. And one risk in this case also is that there's a risk of Chinese dumping towards the EU. There are papers looking at that, and historically indeed, when there are tariffs put by the US on China, typically you have an increase of 13% of exports of China towards the EU. So you can have an idea on whether dumping is good or not. As you know, there's a debate among trade economists on this, but clearly this will not be good news for certain industries in the EU. And as we know, the next target of the US is going to be the European Union and the car industry. Maybe I'll talk more about this later. Okay, so that was just to put into context of what's happening, but I'm going to have a larger view on this. So I'm going to talk about trade wars and macroeconomics. So clearly it's not a very standard shock. As a macroeconomist, we are not used to have these trade shocks in macroeconomic models. The policy response, which often the first one is retaliation, is not standard either, because actually retaliation means more of a shock. Okay, so from that point of view, it's not completely obvious. There are several perspectives that I'm going to take in this presentation. And it's going to be from the less to the more speculative. At the end, I'll talk about some preliminary work that I'm doing. And I'm going to first look at what is the impact of protectionism on macroeconomics, on macro, with the long run impact, where we'll see that there are efficiency losses for all countries. But the interesting question is to what extent they are distributed equally, et cetera, et cetera. And then the short run, which is, I think, more difficult and where I think there are more disagreements among macroeconomists. You know, there may be efficiency losses, but they may be smaller. To what extent the uncertainty is important or not for macroeconomists. And in a sense, my conclusion at that stage would be that I don't think, and that's I'm taking a risk here, but I don't think that the trade war per se can generate a global recession, except if it morphs into a financial crisis. But in a sense, if we understand, or we try to understand how Trump works, given that he looks a lot at the financial markets, maybe there's a bit of hope that he will react if indeed it generates a financial crisis. But maybe too late. But my view is that clearly the trade shock per se, the trade war, the tariff are not large enough from a macro point of view to generate a recession, again, except if it morphs into a financial crisis. And then in a second time, I will talk about how macroeconomics affect actually protectionism, how macroeconomics can predict trade attacks. So I'll look at the other relation, and in particular, I'll talk about bilateral and global trade imbalances and how and whether they predict protectionist tensions. Okay, so I'll start with macro consequences of trade wars. So indeed, you said that I was advising the government. So we're doing at the council, we're doing some work based on models and empirical work, where we try to look at indeed the macro consequences of trade wars. So this is based on some joint work with Sébastien Jean and André Sapir, which I'm going to talk about. So what we look at in this paper is the long-term effects of trade wars. Next, I'll talk also about more short-term effects. So we're looking at a scenario that in a paper, in the JPE paper by Ossa, which is a very strong scenario because it's a scenario where you put tariffs of up to 60% on all trade flows. So it's a very large trade war. We look at two variants of this trade war, what we call total trade war. And in this case, so it's not total in the sense that the EU remains the EU, so there's no exit except, of course, for the Brexit, which I'll talk a little bit about later on. And then a limited trade war where the intra-EU trade flows are unaffected, and also the trade flows between countries which have signed free trade agreements. Okay, so it's a more limited one. That's the two scenarios we wanted to look at. And the methodology is by now a relatively standard methodology. So it's new quantitative trade models a la Costino and Rodriguez. And actually, this is based on some work for this particular paper by Vicar at CEPI. So the methodology is relatively standard. So what you do in this new quantitative trade models is to estimate parameters, in particular the effect of past trade barriers on trade flows through gravity equations. And once you have them, and you do a counterfactual in the sense of simulating the effects of increase in trade flow. So we have many countries in this simulation, and basically we're going to look at the effect on trade flows of these trade wars and GDP per capita. Again, this is long term, so this is when prices and wages are fully adjusted, employment is completely adjusted, etc., etc. So I'll talk more about well, a little bit on short-term effects. So here are the results where you can see in dark blue the full-scale trade war and then in gray the limited trade war. So this is the losses in GDP per capita. And so the losses come from where? The losses come from basically distortions, which are generated by these tariffs. In sense that clearly if there are trade flows that's coming from both gains of economies of scales and comparative advantage. So if you put trade distortions, you're going to lose in this case. We have, to a limited extent, introduced global value chains in the sense that the cost of inputs is also going to rise, and that's going to have an effect on final good prices and therefore on GDP per capita. Basically, trade wars mean an increase in the price index and therefore a fall in GDP per capita. You have to understand also that, of course, if there is a tariff, if US puts tariff on the EU and the EU retaliates with tariffs on the US, you're going to destroy enormous amounts of trade flows between US and EU, but you're going to recreate a lot of trade flows, say, between France and Italy. So in the model, clearly, there's trade destruction, but there's also trade creation in the sense that, again, those countries which do not put tariffs on each other, and here we assume the EU remains unaffected, it remains the EU and the single market without tariffs, etc. That means there's a lot of trade which is recreated inside the EU, and I'm going to say that actually it's a big effect. It's important. Okay, so if you take the EU, the US, and China, you see that basically US, China, and EU is here. Yeah, basically it's around 3-4% of GDP per capita. Okay, in terms of losses. So you can have a debate on is this big or not, because you're destroying a lot of trade by doing this. So in a sense, you could be surprised that it's not gigantic, it's not the end of the world in a sense. Still 3%, if you look at some of the estimates by the OECD on the permanent effect of for example, the financial crisis, that would be around the same order. So still, you can say, it's a permanent loss of around 3% of GDP per capita for these large countries. So it's not small, but at the end also, and we know it as trade economists, it's not the end of the world. It's not 20-30%, even though, again, the trade war in this case is a really big one, it's a big shock. Now, of course, it depends on the size of the country. You see that Ireland, a small country which trades a lot with the US, is affected super strongly. And here, in this case, it's 12% in this case. And in a limited trade war, it's much smaller. Canada, you see, also is very much affected. You see that in this case, it's not affected. And why? Because in this case, remember, NAFTA, or the new one, I never remember its name, but the new North American Free Trade Area agreement, between US, Canada, and Mexico is left unaffected, and therefore the trade loss is much smaller in this case. Okay. So what is important is that EU, US, and China are very much protected by the fact that they are large markets. So there's a lot more trade between, again, France, Germany, Italy, etc. There's a lot more trade between basically Louisiana and Massachusetts also, basically. Okay, so you recreate some trade, and that protects, in a sense, relatively those countries, and that's important. If I remember well, I think between France and Germany, and there's an increase of trade of 30%. Because of that. So there's a large creation of trade, but a large destruction of trade. And at the end, of course, it's negative. So that's the first one. So we look also at the trade agreements. So those who do trade know that actually when you look at trade agreements and you try to have to quantify economic gains of trade agreements, you find tiny things. One has to, I think in the EU we've oversold to a certain extent the gains from trade in a situation where already we are almost at free trade and the tariffs are super small, etc., etc. So here it's not only tariff, actually it's also typically we go further in looking at a trade agreement where you have a deeper trade agreement where you have harmonization of regulations and things like this. Okay, so we look at an average trade agreement where there's more than tariff. Okay, but even that you can see that, for example, if you take a country with I think I'm missing the I'm missing the vertical countries here. So here, in fact, if I remember well, so this is the gain with Canada. Okay, so this is Canada here. Sorry, this line here, and this is Switzerland. Okay, so let's take these two. So Canada, you see that for European Union, signing a trade agreement with Canada, yeah, it's positive, but it's 0.03% of GDP, and it's super small. But for Canada, you see that actually it's 0.4%. So it's a typical thing that small countries are going to gain much more from trade agreements than large countries. And it's typical of trade agreements because when you sign trade agreements, I exchange tariff concessions, so I give you, and it's symmetric, these tariff concessions. But of course, the market size is not symmetric. So clearly, you get much more gains for Canada and for the European Union. The same thing for Switzerland. Switzerland, in its existing trade agreement, gains a lot from the trade agreement with the EU. We gain also 0.11%, but you know, it's not huge. So that's a feature which is quite intuitive, but it's important quantitatively to remember that the gains from trade agreements are super asymmetric from that point of view, and they are much larger, of course, for small countries than for large countries. Here you have agreements with the US, with China, etc. So you do see that actually with the US, here it's very symmetric, which makes sense because the country size is very symmetric. So in this case, you would have symmetric gains. Okay. So our view in this note is that we should maybe update a bit our views on trade agreements. They are modest, purely economic gains. I'm not saying, again, in a sense, what I take as a policy implication is that these trade agreements do not generate a lot of gains per se, but actually removing them or having a trade war is bad. That's clear. But new trade agreements, we should not oversell them to our constituents from that point of view. Okay, in new trade models, and because also they are decreasing returns on gains from trade. However, one thing we say, and this is linked to this difference between these different lines. For example, if I take Italy, between a full-scale trade war and a trade war where basically Italians can still sell to countries with which the European Union has trade agreements, there is an insurance dimension to these trade agreements. Suppose you are entering in a trade war with the US, maybe it's good to have these trade agreements with other countries, with Japan, for example. We just signed an agreement with Japan. So these are, in some sense, there's a new dimension maybe for these trade agreements, which is this insurance. If the trade war breaks, it's good to have these routes which are still open from that point of view. Okay. So that's the first part. one thing we do also, we say, and I have to admit here, in a sense, it's a policy recommendation which is a bit risky because we've just seen that indeed Trump is using trade policies for political purposes. Look at what happens with Mexico. So he's mixing trade with migration policy. So is that a good thing? In a sense, I think we have to accept this new dimension of trade. And what we're saying here is that we should, in the EU, have a certain consistency on our preferences. One of them is climate change. And from that point of view, I do agree with, indeed, the views that we should not sign trade agreements with countries which, for example, have exited the Paris Agreement, because we have to be kind of consistent. But there are other views, which I understand, in a sense, which say, no, trade agreements is trade agreements, and political issues are other, and we should not mix them, because otherwise it's going to be very dangerous. From that point of view, I think that clearly different countries in the EU have different views on this issue, on whether we should mix these or not. We take clearly the stand that actually we should, if there are not large economic gains from these trade agreements, but we have a lot of power because we are super large market, we should use these market size dimension, maybe to push maybe some other dimensions than trade per se. Just a word on UK, because I guess that's another hot topic. So what happens when whether or not there is a trade agreement? So as you know, if there's no trade agreement, we go to WTO. So if there's no trade agreement between the UK and the EU, this is the WTO, so this is the dark blue, so this is the loss in this case for those countries, again, as a percentage of GDP per capita. So that's the worst scenario, and that's the worst scenario for the UK and for everybody in this case, because we go back to tariffs, and more than tariffs, actually, we go back to a situation where there's no harmonization of regulation, the single market, there's no single market anymore between the UK and the EU, etc. And so what we estimate is a large fall in terms of trade flows, and in the long term, a large decrease in GDP per capita. You see that Ireland also is very much a victim in this case, because of course it's of its special geography. UK has a large impact, much larger than the so you see that for UK, going to WTO scenario is almost like a full trade war. It's almost like 3%, a bit less than 3% of its GDP. You see that the most ambitious one would be the Norway type of agreement. So the Norway agreement is one where they're almost like in the single market. They have access to the single market, and it's almost like they were in the European Union. So in this case, the trade loss is much smaller. And you see that for countries like Germany, France, and Italy, the losses are there, but they're not huge actually from that point of view, except for a country like Ireland. Okay, a word, because you mentioned this. This is a paper that I did in 2008. I think we should always remind ourselves that trade is not only about trade, and sometimes it has political implications. So there's this old view that trade is good for peace, going back to Montesquieu and le doux commerce. And there's a large literature, of course, in political science and in economics on this. So destroying trade relations may also, at some point, have also some political implications. And so here we look at to what extent trade affects the probability of conflicts, of military conflicts, in a paper in our study. Clearly, there are many endogeneity issues to tackle. We try to tackle them as best as we can. So there's a theory part and an empirical part. Just to give you the message, because in some sense it's related to what we are experiencing today. So what we show is that when you have an increase in bilateral trade flow, so if I trade more with you, indeed the opportunity cost of an escalation of a dispute into a military conflict is very high because we have a lot of trade relations, and therefore bilateral trade is indeed peace inducing, okay, because we have an incentive to try to find an agreement if there's a dispute to avert escalation of a dispute into a war. But, and in a sense, maybe it's the more, so that's in some sense the typical liberal view of trade, that trade is good for peace, okay? But what we show from a theoretical point of view and also empirically is actually that multilateral trade, and which is a big part of globalization, actually may not be so good for peace. And the reason is that if I start to trade with all of you, but I have some disputes with you because, you know, of ethnic issues, religious issues, border issues, etc., etc. If I trade a lot with the others, okay, then I have less incentive to not to escalate a bilateral dispute into a war, okay? And we show that empirically it's true, okay? And in particular for African countries, we think that opening trade between African countries and the EU is good, and certainly from a purely economic point of view, it's good. However, that means that they are less dependent on each other at a local level. And actually, we show that it increases the probability of a military conflict in this case. So you see that globalization, in terms of the impact on military conflicts, may not always be good. Okay? Right? So that's just a parenthesis because it's trade wars, but it's also wars in a sense. So, okay. Okay, so let's go now from to trade war to macroeconomic crisis. So here it's more going towards the short term. Until when do I have? No, just how much?
Half an hour, no?
Another half an hour. Okay, okay. Okay, so here I'll just have one slide because actually I haven't really worked on that. So I'll just say what I understand from the literature. So first, protectionism acts more like a negative supply shock. There's no macro stimulus, and this is a recent paper by Bilateral and others. And also, it does not rebalance the trade balance. I mean, in a sense, there's empirical work and showing that indeed, when you put tariffs, it's not going to affect the trade balance or very little. It has very little impact. So you have DSG models that have looked at the impact of trade tariffs, quotas, or in these models. And my reading of these models is that, and that I was saying at the beginning, is that the direct effect looks small actually. If you put into these models some trade costs, yes, there's an increase in production costs, there's an increase in consumer prices, but you have tariff receipts so that you can redistribute. Maybe, I mean, it's not obvious whether you have monetary tightening or loosening, and we have this debate right now with the Fed, etc. And potentially there's a fall in exports if there's retaliation. Okay, but all this quantitatively is not going to be huge, even in the short term. And so basically, what you require in these models to have a relatively large effect is that, in a sense, a bit in a ad hoc way, you have to add in the models to generate something that looks like a recession. And so basically, you need something, especially on the financial part, you need to have a tightening of the financial conditions, that the default probability because of the trade war increases because of liquidity constraints for firms. But basically, you need this, and you need also an uncertainty shock. Okay, so we do know, there is this trade literature that uncertainty is bad for trade, it's bad for investment, but in these models, basically, you need a big shock on the VIX, for example, on uncertainty on financial markets. It's possible, I'm not saying it's impossible, but you really need to work a bit hard in the model to have something quantitatively large. So maybe I'm too optimistic, and maybe I hope I'm not wrong, because if I'm wrong, that's really bad for us. But again, the only way to get quantitatively a large effect is basically that this morphs into a financial crisis. It's possible, but basically it's not endogenous. You basically have you have to add it in the model to get it. Okay. Okay, so part 2, now I'm going to talk about how basically macro imbalances, trade imbalances, both multilateral and bilateral, may affect protectionist attack and may generate some protectionist attacks. Okay, so this is based on some preliminary work that I'm doing with Samuel Delpech and Etienne Fils, who are at the council. Okay, so basically here we're asking something which I think has not been looked at very much, which is to what extent macro imbalances predict protectionist attacks by countries. So we've seen that indeed there are some work on how protectionist measures affect bilateral and multilateral trade imbalances. Basically, there's nothing much. There's nothing much found that trade affects these trade imbalances. But so what we're going to look at is to what extent bilateral and multilateral trade imbalances predict these protectionist measures, and I'm clearly going to here motivate by the Trump attacks. Okay. So here, yeah, it's easy with tweets by Trump. This is not even the most recent one. Clearly, you have ones on China and Germany. I don't have the Chinese one. I have the one on Germany. We have a massive trade deficit with Germany, so Germany is the next one. France I could have said Italy, of course, but France is also, he's just repeated it, I think, yesterday or 2 days ago, so clearly we are on the next target also. So the issue is, I mean, for us is our protectionist measures politically motivated, and in this case, it's interesting to understand what are the determinants of this motivation, or are they just stochastic? In a sense, that would be good also for us, because if they're stochastic, they are good natural experiments of these things. But I'm going to tell you that it looks that there's a bit of motivation, I mean, of determinism in this. Okay. So I'm going to show you very, very, very preliminary evidence on this. I'm going to use a database which I have to say is not perfect. It's called the Global Trade Alert Database. So it's a database that looks at since 2009 up to 2017. Actually, we're getting the data for 2018, but I won't show you the results for 2018 because it's too preliminary. And so basically, they look at all the harmful interventions at the bilateral and multilateral level of protectionist attacks. Okay, so they compute all the tariff lines on which, for example, the US or the EU, because I'm going to show you that the EU also puts some tariffs and quotas, and maybe in retaliation, but still. And so basically here, I'm going to take protectionist attacks. I'm going to measure the extent of protectionist attacks as the number of tariff lines on different goods on which a country puts either tariffs or quotas. They look at other things, but we take the most, in some sense, restrictive definition of what is a protectionist attack. Is basically I put a tariff on you, or I put a quantitative quota, and the extent of the attack is going to be measured by the number of tariff lines on different goods, which these tariffs and quotas are going to be put. Okay, so mostly it's going to be before Trump. Okay, I'm going to show you a little bit of Trump, but mostly it's going to be before Trump. And we're going to first test a theoretical hypothesis. I'll give you a bit of a theoretical framework at the end. So basically the questions I'm going to ask is, do bilateral and multilateral trade imbalances predict protectionist attack? Okay? And I'll tell you at the end why actually it may be politically motivated, to what extent. I'm also going to ask the question, how does this play in the EU? Because we have a common trade policy. So what that means is that, and you know this is a bit of a concern for certain countries. We have certain countries in the EU like Germany, Netherlands, which have very large trade imbalances, both at the multilateral and the bilateral level with the US, okay? But of course, if there's a trade war, a full-scale trade war between the US and the EU, the tariff lines, increase for everybody, because we have a common tariff, external tariff. So basically, when the US attacks, if the US attacks completely, for the moment it's been limited to just aluminum and steel, but if the US attack the EU, it will be on all of us from that point of view. So is there evidence of certain collateral damage? That's one question we ask, in the sense that to what extent the fact that some countries have large global imbalances, both bilateral and multilateral, affects countries which do not have these global imbalances, because they may generate trade attacks determined by these imbalances. Okay? So just to show you, one thing which is important, is related to a bit what I was saying before. We think that Trump is the one that started the attack. It's not completely true, actually. If you look at, so these are the number of trade attacks. So this is the number of basically tariff lines on which there's this year an increase in the tariff or a quota, okay, at the total level. So it's all countries. Here, Germany, but actually it's EU. In fact, it's European Union, because we have a common trade policy. So you see that for the US, actually, it started before Trump. So of course, so this is 2017, so this is Trump, but you see that actually there's even a start of this trade attacks before Trump, because remember, the Obama administration was actually complaining a lot, in fact, against China, etc. Okay, so this is just to motivate, and this is just suggestive. So this is basically, remember, one of the questions we're going to ask is, to what extent protectionist attacks are correlated or determined, for the moment there's no causality, it's just a correlation, with the trade balance, the bilateral trade balance of country here, let's say France, and the US. In this case, I'm just looking at the US, okay, so here, the vertical line is the number of tariff lines or tariff attacks by the US against France, Germany, and all these other countries, okay? And basically as a percentage of GDP of the US. So you have a lot of zeros, and basically these are the super tiny countries for which, even if they have a trade surplus with the US, as a percentage of the US GDP is very small. Okay, but you see that for Germany it's a bit large. So basically here you already see a positive correlation. Of course, it's just a simple correlation. I'm going to show you some regressions with more things, but basically you have this. And actually I didn't put China, okay, but because it was too much to the right. But if I put China, China is here. So actually China is under attack, in a sense, from that point of view, because China, as you know, does not have a large multilateral trade imbalance. Its trade imbalance today is 2% of GDP. It used to be 10% in 2009, so it's much smaller. But China has a large bilateral trade surplus with the US. So from that point of view, and indeed even, so this is 2017, we don't even have the data for 2018, but that would be a complete explosion from that point of view. So maybe it would, the regression, so clearly China is an outlier, okay? So then what we do is to indeed look, so this is a simple regression. First, this is only US 2017. This is US before 2017, US, EU, Japan, and China. Okay, so here I'm looking at attackers. Okay, so I'm trying to explain the attacks by these countries by the fact that they attack countries which have a bilateral trade balance surplus, and how large it is, as a percentage of the GDP of the country that attacks. So again, taking the US, okay, I'm trying to explain the fact that there's a lot of attacks by the US against, say, the EU, against China, South Korea, etc., and how is it explained by the bilateral trade balance of, say, the South Korea with the US. Okay, it's smooth over 5 years because, in a sense, clearly from 1 year to another does not work very well, huh? So it's smooth on the 5 years. So you see that indeed for the US it's very correlated. Okay, we also take here we add the lagged attack, because if I attack you, it may be because you have a large trade imbalance with me, but it may be because simply retaliation. And in this case, it's not going to be driven by our imbalance because it's going to work in the other direction. So it's important, in fact, and indeed, clearly, I attack you sometimes because not of our trade imbalance, but simply because last year you attacked me. Okay, and indeed, that's an important part. So it's from now on, we'll always have this as a control. Interestingly, you see that actually it was always the case that the US trade attacks were driven by, or at least correlated by these bilateral trade surpluses or deficits from the point of view of the US, much more than the EU. So this is the EU. Japan, you see, there's nothing, and actually China, it's even negative. It goes in the wrong direction. But so it's really true that even before 2017, the trade attacks by the US against countries were driven by their trade imbalances more than the EU, and even more so than Japan. But you see that actually EU also is correlated with that. So going a bit further, so this is now going at with more controls and with much more observation. So here more than 45,000 observations. So you do see that it's indeed at the world level. So this is not anymore the US. You have all the countries that may attack other countries or not. So you see that indeed at the world level, and since 2009, you've seen quite a lot of attacks which are correlated with bilateral trade balances. So if I have a trade surplus with you, there is more probability that you attack me with tariff. Okay, and you see that this is so this is for all countries. What we find also that is very much driven actually by large countries. Large countries are the ones that attack. Basically, the small countries are not initiating trade wars, which in a sense is not completely counterintuitive. But basically, the coefficient is much larger if you only look at EU countries, US, China, and OECD. Okay, we have more controls, but basically, that's the message. Okay. One interesting thing was this collateral damage issue. So remember, we have common trade policies. So if the US attacks Germany because Germany has a trade imbalance with the US, all the EU countries are also going to be attacked because we have exactly the same tariff with the US. So in this case, what you see is that indeed, so there's here the fact that, so it's an interaction term between the bilateral trade balance of the country which is attacked as a percentage of GDP of the attacker, okay, multiplied by EU dummy, okay, and you see that it's negative. So what it means is that in a sense, let me take two countries. Germany has a trade surplus with the US. It's less attacked, or its bilateral trade balance with the US does not affect as much, does not predict as much trade attacks by the US, even though it has a large trade imbalance. Or another way to say it is that a country that would have a trade deficit with the US would still be attacked because it is in the EU. Okay, so from that point of view, indeed, there seems to be collateral damage. Being in the EU means attacks are less driven by trade imbalances. Okay. We also asked to what extent, in addition to bilateral, multilateral trade surpluses or deficits predict attacks, and we do find that indeed countries which have large multilateral trade imbalances are more attacked than the others, and countries which have multilateral trade surpluses attack deficits, attack less the other countries. So at the end, what we find is that bilateral and multilateral trade imbalances do predict attacks, trade attacks on countries. As macroeconomists, we think that bilateral trade deficits and surpluses are not something we should look at. We should, maybe multilateral trade imbalances are a problem from a macro point of view, not from a trade point of view. But here it looks as if indeed what matters for these protectionist attacks is indeed both multilateral and bilateral trade imbalances, and they do predict quite well these attacks. Okay. Okay, so let me finish with trying to put just a little bit of structure, and it's super preliminary. So I'm not going to show you something very very strong. But basically, we're trying to understand why is it? I mean, why is it that bilateral trade imbalances could matter to predict trade attacks? It's not completely obvious. So one way we did is to look at basically in a monopolistic trade model framework, the choice of tariffs and what is the impact of tariffs on employment. So here we take a very ad hoc view on what drives trade policy, which is I want to maximize domestic employment. Okay, so it's completely ad hoc. So, but that's starting from there. I want to maximize employment. So in particular, I discount the effect on consumers. I could have it. I can tell you how it changes the results, but I discount the consumers and I put more weight on employment and workers, basically. And at the end, what you get is to try to understand. So if you look at country H, okay, that basically asks itself whether to increase tariffs on country I, okay, basically you look at the elasticity of domestic employment with respect to tariff, and tariff are going to have two effects, actually three, but the last one is not very important. So sigma is just the standard trade elasticity, so it's going to be the elasticity of trade to tariff, okay? That's the reason it's here. So basically what you see is that this animal here, this is basically imports to GDP and this is exports to GDP. So just forget for a moment these two terms. This is the bilateral trade imbalance as a percentage of the GDP of the country that attacks, okay? So basically it's very close, it's not exactly, but it's very close to the bilateral trade imbalance, okay? And remember, that's what we find in the data, that the trade imbalance is what matters, the bilateral trade imbalance. So where does this come from? So it's, as you see, it's weighted exports minus, in some sense, weighted imports minus weighted exports, and you see that if you forget these two terms, this P and this thing here, basically it's the current account or the trade imbalance, which I was putting in the regression before. Okay, so it's very close. So where does it come from? Well, so why do imports? The more I import from you as a percentage of GDP of my GDP, okay, basically the more I have incentive to put tariffs. Why? Because if I put tariffs, I'm going to lower competition. Okay, I'm going to increase production at the local level, at the domestic level, and that's going to increase employment. Okay, but it's going to be weighted by this thing, and basically it's going to, why is this weighted by this thing? Because basically this is going to measure the importance of domestic competition for total employment, for domestic employment. Okay, and so that's the reason it's here. But I have to potentially expect that there will be retaliation. So if I put tariffs on you, potentially there's going to be some retaliation, which are going to, so that's the probability of retaliation, and that's a loss for employment of my export firms, and that's going to be bad, a negative for me, and that's basically going to be put here. Okay, so that's the expected loss related to export and related to the probability of retaliation. There's a third thing, but it's actually a second order effect on competition on export markets. So we've put that in the data to see whether it was better. I'm not going to show you the regressions, but indeed it looks as if these things work well too. But again, in a sense, they're very, it's almost an approximation of the bilateral trade deficit. So in a sense, it's a rationalization of why bilateral trade deficit potentially matter to predict employment. So in a sense, I'm not saying Trump is right, okay? I'm just saying that in a sense we can rationalize if we think that Trump is trying to maximize employment. Okay, so let me conclude. What I've tried to say is that protectionist measures have a negative impact on GDP, both in the long term, maybe in the short term, but I'm not completely sure that by per se they can generate a global recession. Bilateral trade imbalances, as macroeconomists, we know they don't matter. They are not a problem from a macro point of view. Multilateral trade imbalances may be a problem, but macro, not a trade problem, and certainly trade policies or tariffs are not going to have any impact on multilateral trade imbalances. So in a sense, Trump is going to attack countries with macro imbalances. It's not, we do think it's a problem, but clearly it's not the right instrument and it's not for the right reasons, okay? It's not new, again, in a sense, not everything is new with Trump. It looks as if the US was doing that before, except that it's amplified clearly by Trump. And again, we don't even have the 2018, and so the 2018 data would go much further. And EU, from that point of view, is clearly vulnerable because of our trade surpluses. I do believe, and here I put my policy hat just for 1 second, I do believe indeed that the trade surpluses of the EU at a multilateral trade level is a problem. It's because of global imbalances, because of financial vulnerabilities, also for the Eurozone, inside the Eurozone. It's not a trade problem, but it generates an additional vulnerability in the sense that clearly, and for wrong reasons again, it may generate some trade attacks in particular by the US. And I'll stop here.